What happens when the hero of liberty, the man who led a revolution against unjust taxation, turns the full power of government against his own people? Imagine the image. George Washington, grey-haired but still imposing in his uniform, mounting his horse once again to lead an army. But this time, he is not heading into battle against Britain, not facing Hessian mercenaries or red-coated soldiers across a field. This time, he is heading west, into Pennsylvania, at the head of nearly 13,000 troops, more soldiers than he commanded at many points in the Revolution, and those soldiers are not marching to repel an invasion. They are marching against American citizens, frontier farmers, men and women who only a few years earlier had believed they were defending liberty by resisting taxation. Why did Washington, the champion of the Revolution, choose to put down this rebellion with such force? Was he preserving the fragile republic from chaos, or was he betraying the very principles he once swore to uphold? That is the mystery of the Whiskey Rebellion. To answer it, we have to rewind to the shaky first years of independence, a time when America's survival was far from certain. When debts loomed large, divisions widened between East and West, rich and poor, and when the meaning of freedom itself was still being fought over in the hills and taverns of the frontier. When the cannons of Yorktown fell silent in 1781 and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the United States celebrated victory. But beneath the fireworks and the parades, the young nation faced a grim reality. It was drowning in debt, tens of millions owed to foreign lenders like France and the Netherlands, millions more owed to merchants, bondholders, and ordinary citizens at home. Revolutionary soldiers returned from war with nothing but IOUs, many selling them at a fraction of their value just to feed their families. Inflation had ravaged the economy, with worthless paper money circulating alongside scarce hard coin. Farmers who had once supplied the Continental Army were left destitute. The Articles of Confederation, the nation's first governing document, had proved too weak. Congress could not levy taxes, enforce laws, or regulate trade. States squabbled among themselves, imposing tariffs and jealously guarding power. For many, the revolution's promise seemed to be slipping away into chaos. Out of this instability came the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the creation of a stronger central government. For some, like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, the new Constitution was salvation. It created an executive branch, a federal court system, and most importantly, the power to raise revenue through taxation. But for others, especially in rural areas, this new government looked suspiciously like the centralized authority they had just overthrown. The ink was barely dry on the Constitution when Alexander Hamilton, now Treasury Secretary, put forward his grand vision for America's financial future. He believed the nation had to establish credit, honor its debts, and demonstrate strength. That meant raising revenue. His solution: an excise tax on distilled spirits, particularly whiskey. On the surface, it seemed logical. Whiskey was widely consumed, widely produced, and easy to monitor. But beneath that logic lay favoritism. Large distillers in the East could pay a flat annual fee, while small distillers in the West, frontier farmers who converted their grain to whiskey to make it transportable and valuable, were taxed by the gallon. This meant that the rich paid less proportionally, and the poor bore the heavier burden. To Hamilton, it was efficiency. To frontier families, it was betrayal. To them, whiskey was not a luxury item. It was survival. It was how you stored grain before it rotted. It was how you paid your debts when coin was scarce. It was how you bartered with neighbors. Whiskey was money, and now the government wanted to tax it. To the farmers west of the Appalachians, who already felt abandoned by Eastern elites, this was not just taxation, it was oppression, a reminder that the revolution's promises of equality and liberty were being hijacked by men in fine clothes who never tilled a rocky hillside or struggled to feed a family in the wilderness. To understand the fury that brewed in the frontier hills, we need to understand life there. Imagine carving a home from dense forest, clearing land with your own hands, and planting crops that may or may not survive harsh winters or raids from hostile forces. Roads were little more than muddy tracks, impassable in bad weather. Hauling a wagon load of corn or wheat over the Appalachians to markets in the east was nearly impossible, often costing more than the grain was worth. The answer for many was distilling. Turn that grain into whiskey, and suddenly you had a compact, durable, and valuable commodity. A barrel of whiskey was worth far more than sacks of grain, and it could be traded, sold, or transported with relative ease. On the frontier, whiskey was not just a drink, it was currency, community, and culture. A whiskey still was as common as a plough, and distilling was passed down from father to son. So when the government targeted whiskey with its new tax, the outrage was immediate. It was not seen as a fair contribution to the survival of the Republic, but as an attack on the very foundation of frontier life. At first, resistance was peaceful but determined. Farmers met in taverns and barns to draft petitions and resolutions demanding repeal or modification. They wrote letters to Congress, pleading their case. But the government, dominated by Eastern interests, largely ignored them. As frustration grew, resistance hardened. Tax collectors sent west found themselves unwelcome. They were jeered at, threatened, and in some cases, physically assaulted. Some were tarred and feathered, a grim ritual that echoed the methods colonists had used against British tax agents just 2 decades earlier. These acts were not random. They were deliberate, symbolic, and meant to remind the government that the revolution had not been forgotten. In western Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Kentucky, local communities began to organize. Militia companies drilled openly, swearing oaths to resist the tax. Courts refused to prosecute offenders. Juries acquitted those charged with evasion. Even local sheriffs and judges sympathized, seeing themselves not as enforcers of distant laws, but as neighbors first. It was as if entire counties had quietly seceded from federal authority. And beneath this simmering anger, darker whispers began to circulate. Some frontier leaders suggested seceding altogether, forming an independent Western nation allied with Spain or France. Others argued that if the revolution's promise was being betrayed, then perhaps it was time for a second revolution, one led not by Virginia planters or New York financiers, but by the farmers of the West. By 1794, the situation reached a breaking point. The flashpoint was the home of John Neville, a wealthy landowner and federal tax inspector in western Pennsylvania. Neville embodied everything the rebels despised: wealth, privilege, and his position as the face of an oppressive tax. When a group of armed men arrived at his home demanding his resignation, Neville refused. Shots rang out. A skirmish followed. A federal soldier was killed. Neville's home, Bower Hill, was besieged by hundreds of angry farmers. When the smoke cleared, buildings were burned, men were dead, and the rebellion had shifted from defiance to open insurrection. Word of the clash spread like wildfire. In towns across the frontier, militias gathered. Meetings were held where fiery speeches denounced the government as tyrannical. Farmers paraded under banners declaring liberty or death, echoing the slogans of 1776. Some called for an armed march on Pittsburgh, others for complete independence from the United States. The government's mail was intercepted, officials were threatened, and rebels began to behave as though they were the true authority in the region. This was no longer just about a whiskey tax. It was about whether the federal government had any real authority west of the Appalachians. Washington and Hamilton saw the danger clearly. To them, this was not just local unrest, it was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Constitution itself. If armed men could drive off federal officials, burn their homes, and intimidate courts without consequence, then what meaning did federal law have? If one region could resist, why not others? The entire experiment of the Republic seemed to hang in the balance. For George Washington, the choice was agonizing but clear. He could not allow the rebellion to stand. If he did, the authority of the Constitution would collapse, and the United States would descend into anarchy. So he invoked the Militia Acts of 1792, calling on state militias to assemble for federal service. The response was overwhelming. Nearly 13,000 troops were mustered from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia. Far more than were needed to face the few thousand rebels, but that was the point. This was not about a proportional response. It was about sending a message. In a moment of extraordinary symbolism, Washington himself chose to lead the troops, the only time in American history that a sitting president has taken the field at the head of an army. To the farmers in Pennsylvania, it was a shocking sight. The general who had once fought for liberty, now riding west to enforce obedience. To Washington, the act was necessary. He believed that a strong show of force would prevent bloodshed by intimidating the rebels into submission. As the massive army advanced, that is exactly what happened. Resistance evaporated. Militia companies melted away into the hills. Leaders fled or went into hiding. A handful of men were arrested and charged with treason, but most were pardoned. There was no great battle, no Gettysburg or Yorktown. The rebellion fizzled in the face of overwhelming force. Yet the lesson was unmistakable. The federal government had both the will and the means to enforce its laws, even against its own citizens. The Whiskey Rebellion ended without a major clash, but its legacy reverberated for generations. For Washington and the Federalists, it was a triumph. The Constitution had passed its first great test. The government had shown that it could raise troops, enforce laws, and maintain order. The young republic had survived a challenge that might have destroyed it. But for many Americans, especially on the frontier, the episode left a bitter scar. They saw Washington's march not as a defense of liberty, but as a betrayal. The government had sided with wealthy distillers in the East and financiers in the cities while crushing the farmers who had shed blood in the Revolution. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The Revolution's promises of equality had been twisted into the enforcement of elite power. The political consequences were enormous. The rebellion deepened the divide between Federalists, who favored a strong central government, and Democratic Republicans, who championed farmers and limited government. Thomas Jefferson seized on the discontent, arguing that Hamilton's system was corrupt and aristocratic. Within a decade, Jefferson would become president, and one of his first acts was to repeal the hated whiskey tax. But even after its repeal, the shadow of the rebellion lingered. It revealed that the Revolution had not answered the central question of American life. What balance should exist between liberty and authority, between the rights of individuals and the power of government. That question was not settled in 1794. It would re-emerge again and again in debates over slavery, over states' rights, over civil war, and even in protests and movements of the modern era. The Whiskey Rebellion stands as one of the great paradoxes of American history. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that liberty and order are not always allies. Sometimes they collide. Was Washington right to march against his own people, proving the strength of the government and preserving the republic from collapse? Or did he betray the very ideals he had once fought for, turning the sword of the revolution back on the farmers who believed they were defending freedom? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the Whiskey Rebellion was both a triumph of government and a tragedy of broken promises. It reminds us that the revolution was not a single event, but an ongoing struggle, one in which every generation has to wrestle with the meaning of freedom. And so we end with the same question that faced Washington and the farmers of Western Pennsylvania. When does defending order become enforcing tyranny? What did you think about today's video? Was Washington a protector of the Republic or a betrayer of liberty? Comment your thoughts and your suggestions for my next video below.